everyone, today we're going to be learning about decimals to fractions, fractions of fractions and percentages. Okay, so we're going to start off with decimals to fractions. These are very important for the 11 plus. You could be given something like 0.1. To turn it into a fraction, it's just 1 over 10. However many spaces there are after the decimal point will tell you how many zeros you're going to have there. So again, 0.3 will be 3 over 10. 0.6 will be 6 over 10. Okay, so if you have two numbers after the decimal, so if you had 0.23, as a fraction, that's going to be 23 over 100. Again, if you had 0.39, that's going to be 39 over 100. It gets a little bit harder if you have something like 0.06. Just be a bit careful because that's still out of 100. It's going to be 6 out of 100. Okay, so if you had three numbers after the decimal, try and think what that might be out of. Okay, so three numbers after the decimal, 0.129 is going to be 129 over 1,000. Again, if you had 0.343, that's going to be 343 over 1,000. Again, it gets a little bit harder if you had 0.024. Because there are still three numbers, it's going to be 24 over 1,000. Okay, so try to think what you think it would be if you had something like 0.008. So that's going to be 8 over 1,000. So all the time you're looking for how many numbers are after the decimal point, and that will tell you how many zeros you're going to have on that bottom number. Okay. Right, so let's try a few. If you had 0.5, 0.63, 0.024, 0.008. Okay, so this one is going to be 5 out of 10. 63 out of 100 and 24 out of 1,000, and again this one 8 over 1,000. Okay. Right, now they may try to catch you out with something a little bit harder. If you had 1.2, now you see you've only got one number after the decimal, it's still going to be out of 10. However, this time it's going to be 12 out of 10. If you had something like 1.42, there's two numbers, so it's going to be out of 100, but it's going to be 142 out of 100. So if you had 2.913, this time there's three numbers. Think what it's going to be out of. It's going to be out of 1,000. So you do 2,913 out of 1,000. It won't be any harder than that. So those are the things that you need to remember. However many decimals it is will tell you how many zeros you're going to have on that bottom number. Okay. Right, now there are a few that you need to remember in the 11 plus. Things like 0.125, you need to be able to see that and automatically realise that it's an eighth. Similarly, the other way round, if you see an eighth, you need to know that it's 0.125. Those numbers come up a lot. If you had something like 0.333 going on forever or recurring, you need to know that that's a third. And 0.666 going on forever or recurring is going to be 2/3. You need to be able to spot those really quickly. Okay. Right. now what we're going to have a look at is fractions of fractions. Okay, so a lot of you would have probably seen things like this, 2/5 of 20, and they're quite easy. You just divide by the bottom and times by the top. But they won't always work like that. It won't always make a whole number. So you need to know a way of doing fractions of fractions or fractions of whole numbers that end in fractions. Okay, so for example, if you had 2/9 of 1/8, you need to remember that of just means times. To times a fraction, you just times them straight across. Okay, so you do 2 times 1 is 2, 9 times 8 is 72, and it's quite easy. So if you had 3/5 of 1/9, you've just got to times across. 3 times 1 is 3, 5 times 9 is 45. You've done your fraction of your fraction. Okay, so let's try a few more of those. If you had 1/2 of 1/3 of 1/4, you're just timesing all the way across. 1 times 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 3 times 4 is 24. Okay? So, sometimes they might make it a little bit harder. They might do something like 4/5 of 9. Now you can't do that using the normal method of divide by the bottom times by the top, or at least not very easily. So an easy way of doing it is to just put over 1 and then times across. Okay, so you've got 4 times 9 is 36, 5 times 1 is 5. Or you could make that into a mixed number, 7 and 1/5. Okay, so let's try that again. If you see a whole number, you can put it over 1 and just do the same thing. So 5/8 of 3, or 6/7 of 8. Okay, so of means times, so we're timesing those. We're putting the whole number over 1, and then can you remember what we do? We just times them across. 5 times 3 is 15, 8 times 1 is 8, and so that can give you 1 and 7/8. Okay, so this one, times it straight across, 6/8 are 48, 7 times 1 is 7, and then make it into a mixed number, which is 6 and 6/7. Okay. Now, these types of fractions will come up most years in your 11+ exams. There will be some sort of timesing fractions, whether it says a fraction of a fraction or just standard timesing. You've got to remember to times across. Percentages. Okay, now again, this will come up every year in your exam, so you need to make sure that you're really confident in all aspects of percentages. Now, the first thing you need to know how to do is 10% of a number. It's really important. So 10% of 80, you just take off a 0, and that's 8. If you had 10% of 300, again, take off a 0, and that's 30. So that's quite easy. Let's do another one. 10% of 4,200, take off a 0 is going to be 420. If, however, they made it a little bit harder and asked you for 10% of 62, there's no 0 to take off. So you put in a decimal place, and that gives you 6.2. So if we try another one, 10% of 591, you put back one decimal place, which gives you 59, 0.1. Now 10% is the most important thing to know. If you don't know how to do 10%, you're going to struggle to do the other things. So if we just run over that again, if you had 10% of 70, try and think what you think that might be. So 10% of 70 is 7, and then a harder one, 10% of 91. Can you remember what you have to do? Put back in 1 decimal, 9.1. Right, so once you've mastered 10%, you can then use that to help you work out more complicated percentages. So if you were doing 30% of 40, for example, you would work out 10% first of all, and then you want 3 of them because you've got 30%. So 10% of 40 is 4. So if you want 30%, you want 3 of those, which is 12. Right, let's do another one. 30% of 60. So you first find out 10%. 10% is 6. You want 3 of those. 3 sixes, 18. Now they can ask you any of those percentages. It could be 20%, 50%, 90%, any of those percentages. And you can use the same technique. So if you wanted to do 70% of 50, you'd find 10%. So 10% of 50 is 5, but you want 7 of them. 7 5s are 35. Let's say you wanted to do 80% of 90. You find 10%, which is 9, but you want 8 of them. 9 8s, 72. See if you can think how you might do 40% of 80. So to do 40% of 80, you find 10% of it, which is 8, and then times it by 4, because you want 4 of them. 4 8s are 32. Okay. You'll also need to know percentages like 5%. Now 10% can help you do that as well. If you know what 10% of a number is, you can just half it to find 5%. So 5% of 60. We know 10% is 6. Chop it in half makes 3. What about 5% of 160? 10% is just 16. Chop it in half, 8. So, what do you think 5% of 120 is going to be? Think of what 10% is, and then chop it in half. And that's going to be 6. Using all of those things, you would now be able to work out something like 35% of 80. You could break it down into 30% and 5%, and then just add them together. So 30%, you do 10% times it by 3 is 24. To do 5%, you take off the 0 to find 10%, chop it in half, which makes 4. So if you're wanting 35%, you add those together, and that makes 28. Let's do another example, and then hopefully you'll have a grasp of some of these basic percentages, and we'll do some harder ones in another lesson. Right, let's try 45% of 400. Now often in the exam there'll be things like pounds or things like grams. So let's do 45% of 400 grams. So you would need to break that down into 40% and also 5%. So 40% is 40 times by 4 is 160 grams. 5%, you do 10%, chop it in half, makes 20 grams. Add them both together, you get 180 grams. Okay. Right, so let's run over the things that we've done in today's lesson. So decimals to fractions first of all. If you had 0.7, do you remember that's 7 out of 10? 0.92 is 92 over 100. What about 0.009? What's that one going to be? So there's 3 numbers, so it's 9 out of 1,000. Right, now can anyone remember what happens when they get a little bit harder? If you had 1.4 as a fraction, do you remember what that is? You've got 1 decimal, so it's 14 out of 10. Okay, then fractions of fractions. What did of mean? Okay, so hopefully you're all saying that of meant times. So if you had 2/7 of 1/8, you just times them across. 2 times 1 is 2. 7 times 8 is 56. So of means times. What about if we had 3/11 of 9? Can you remember what you did with the whole number? You have to put the whole number over 1. And then you just times straight across again. 3 times 9, 27. 11 times 1 is 11. So you get 2 and 5/11. Okay. Then lastly, percentages. How did you find 10% of 520? You just took off the 0, 52. What about 10% of 91? You remember? You hop back 1 decimal and that makes 9.1. So, if you were doing something tricky, like 75% of 600, you could break that down into 70% and 5%. 70% is going to be 60 times 7, 420, and 5%, you remember what you do? You do 10%, chop it in half, which makes 30. Add them both together and you get 450. Right, that's all that we're going to do today. If you wanted to buy any of my weekly packs of work, the link to my website and my email address are on the bottom of the page. Thank you very much.